The nerds will pay for this. Heads will roll. Guts will fly. I'm gonna go on a podcast as soon as I get permission.
What's happening, Hellspawn? This is Spawnography, and that was a quote from Spawn issue 11, which we will be discussing today. This issue is the final issue of the CoCoSwiss. Before we get into that, I just want to say my name is George Marston. My pronouns are they, them, or she, her. And with me, as always, is my co-host.
Pierce. I'm also they, them.
And we are going to talk about the issue of Spawn that is written by one Frank Miller. Don't know if you've heard of him. Kind of an obscure cult figure in the comic industry.
Yeah, this is certainly an issue of a comic book.
It
With
is.
Spawn on the cover.
And in the pages. It is part of what is called the CoCoSwiss, which stands for
Comics Critics Special Writers something.
Basically, it is the premise of Todd McFarlane having 4 all-star writers from the comic industry come into Spawn as co-writers and sole writers for issues that he draws for 4 issues in a row, basically as a response to criticism of early issues that he is a bad writer.
Honestly, what this issue does is maybe prove that we didn't have it all that bad when Todd was writing.
As you said, it is definitely an issue of a comic book. This one written by Frank Miller, and I think that of all the CoCoSwiss issues, of all the CoCoSwiss issues, this one feels the most like Todd McFarlane could have just written it, and maybe it would have even been better.
Yeah, it's let me get the credits out of the way. This issue is called Home, story by Frank Miller, art by Todd McFarlane, letters and editor Tom Orzechowski, colors by Steve Oliff, Ruben Rudin, Oleoptics. Something to note here is that Oleoptics gets credited with a full breakdown of who Oleoptics is.
Oh,
and that is Tracy Anderson, Denise Vine, Kathy Ennis, Emily Jordan, Patty Stratton Jordan, Kirk Mobert, Abel Mountain, Quinn Suplee, Kiko Taganashi, and William Zindel. This is also the first issue so far that is not distributed by Malibu. This is an Image Comics joint all the way. Also, Malibu. Director of Creative Development Terry Fitzgerald and graphics coordinator Julia Simmons. This one is dedicated to Gil Kane.
Another great comics luminary from the early days of the Silver Age superhero boom. Who
also had some. Did Gil Kane do some Daredevil?
And Spider-Man. Yep.
That's the kind of the connection here as well, right? If we're gonna have Frank Miller, most famously writer of Dark Knight Returns and
never heard of
Daredevil.
No, I have definitely heard of Dark Knight Returns. I'll get it right out of the way because, if you're listening to this, there's a good chance you know me. And if you know me, you have heard me talk about that I am not a Frank Miller fan. And I'm not going to get too into that. And that's not necessarily what has colored my view of this issue, because I'm also definitely not a Dave Sim fan by any stretch.
Yeah.
And his issue was at least had some kind of interesting concept behind it. That was last episode. You can listen to get the full perspective on that. But Dark Knight Returns, I tried to read it again recently because I kind of liked it when I was young. The art's pretty interesting and good. I tried to read it again and it just felt like Rudy Giuliani's Batman. Like, it just felt like Batman should be like founding the Disney store in Times Square at the end of Dark Knight Returns. It's just so brutalist and like reactionary.
There's an
So,
interesting thing about Dark Knight Returns where it's funny that it is what has sort of colored the last 40 years of Batman comics. Right? That's the big switch in Batman comics
mhm.
for a lot of people is like, and it's interesting because he's wearing the gray and blue like
It's
Adam
still
West suit.
cited, you know.
Yeah,
Batman Year One, also a huge influence. I actually like it a little better. David Mazzucchelli's art, mwah. But that's all kind of a different podcast. But just to get get it out of the way, I'm not really that much of a Frank Miller fan, and I think a lot of the things that I dislike about him as a creator really come out in his writing of this issue.
for me, Frank has always just been somebody that looms very large in comics because of Dark Knight Returns
Because of his
and that whole like
Daredevil, you know.
and his Daredevil, of course, and the idea that he was one of those guys who it didn't matter which company he was working for, he was going to do his thing, and he was going to have some great like work there, and then he, obviously if there's 300 in Sin City, more importantly, his work with Jeff Darrow, which is
Yeah.
right around the time of this as
Mhm.
well.
When he was really making his name for himself as a writer and not as both an artist and a writer, or as just an artist. And that's something that's important to note as well, as Frank Miller started in comics as just an artist and was one of a wave of younger artists in the late 70s and early 80s that were changing the language of comics again. The Canadian being another one. We know who that is, as Chris Claremont calls John Byrne. But there was a wave of these younger creators, and there's no doubt that Frank Miller taking that voice that, as you said, he has as an artist and a writer, and making it a priority in whatever character or story he's writing or whatever comic he's writing, making his voice and his vision a priority is something that I think definitely rubbed off on Todd McFarlane.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of the whole point of the CoCoSwiss is like these are folks that I admire on some level, whether it's based on their talent specifically or their sort of business acumen. Again, we kind of get into the Dave Sim of it all last episode. And
Yeah. Just to recap real quick, the writers that were part of the CoCoSwiss were in order: Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman, Dave Sim, and now Frank Miller, just for
right,
context.
right. So you really have obviously, Alan Moore, Watchmen, 1986 being a watershed year, but you have Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns right around the same time. You have Sandman. Sandman's probably is Sandman still ongoing at this point, or has it just
Yeah, he
wrapped?
is. No, it is. It wraps a little later on in the 90s.
Yeah,
It's definitely kind of right around this time, still at the height of its popularity. Maybe not the absolute height, but it was still extremely popular, extremely well regarded. Neil Gaiman's still synonymous with Sandman at this point. This is well before 1602, his
right,
Marvel work, his other, latter date. Well, we discussed that in other episodes.
right. And then Dave Sim with the longest running writer artist kind of independent comic at the time. So it's
Cerebus,
understand
yeah.
and a fellow Canadian. So we can understand why these are the folks that Todd throws some money at and says, "Hey, please write some Spawn." That's it. This issue is it always sucks, right? You and I have written tons of reviews of comics, and it always sucks when you're writing a review and you get to a point where you're like, this feels something about this feels off. It feels rushed, or it feels you start to try to figure out what was going on behind the scenes because that's the only explanation for the work that kind of came out of it. This feels kind of like you said earlier, like Frank Miller copied Todd McFarlane's homework.
It feels like Frank Miller was like, "Tell me about Spawn." And Todd McFarlane was like, "Well, he's like a demon guy. He's got a magical costume, and he lives in an alley, and he kills these, he fights sometimes with guns." And Frank Miller was like, "I understand now. I'm going to write it." And it feels a lot like Spawn in RoboCop 2, which is kind of the one mode that Frank Miller was really running on at that time. Frank Miller did, in fact, write a treatment of RoboCop 2.
And three.
And 3, yeah. and 3. But RoboCop 2, the premise was two gangs fighting over this really deadly drug. RoboCop got in the
Which
middle.
is also the premise of Dark Knight Returns for a large portion of it.
It's a thing. Well, it's a thing. This was at the Frank Miller came to prominence as a writer as well as an artist in the later 80s with The Dark Knight Returns, with Batman Year One, primarily The Dark Knight Returns being the book that really just brings him into like absolute megastar status where he's able to kind of write his own ticket thereafter.
Yeah. And Born Again comes after that as sort of like a,
Right. He
hey,
goes back into Daredevil.
right.
But this is in the late 80s, which is at the absolute height of the war on drugs. Frank Miller is a person whose politics, at least as they are on the page at this time, is very reactionary. We know that he becomes at least very reactionary after 9/11. He's made that very clear a lot of times that is a thing that kind of changed his view on the world. But even in this day, he seems to really be bought into at least the drama of the war on drugs as a backdrop for inner city crime and stories that use that as their kind of gritty realist take on things. Like Dark Knight Returns is in no way the cartoon 1966, holy smokes, Batman. It
Right.
is ironically because he does Holy Terror later on, but it is very much a like, this is the grim and gritty Batman of the streets, and there's like a Joker in it, and it's like dark, and that's very mature in comparison, or what is considered mature in comics and superhero comics at the time. And it is very, very much grounded in its time and place as, again, reactionary to that war on drugs and to that setting and that backdrop of this is what an urban environment is like, is this chaotic, violent landscape. Now, the irony of that is in this issue, the two gangs who will come to meet as we go through it, the nerds and the creeps, my favorite two gangs, because they're absolutely the two gangs of the fans on the internet. I am definitely a member of the nerds in that regard. But the nerds and the creeps, they look like they're out of a Prince video or something, or like a Michael Jackson like dance off. Like they're very much like breaking to Electric Boogaloo, like weird 80s cyberpunk kind of like, and this is the 90s, but it's like a very,
It does feel like a weird holdover. Like as much as I said, it feels like he was, copying Todd McFarlane's homework. It also kind of feels like he had a throwaway script with like any characters in it and just
yeah,
puts like kind of control F'd Batman out for Spawn or like,
exactly. It
and
feels
it's
like
just
runoff
that
of
kind
that
of,
whole, yeah. And so okay, so starting off the issue, Spawn is having nightmares in his alley where he lives with a bunch of unhoused people. And they're trying to wake him up. Al, snap out of it. And so Al is like kicking around, he's flailing, and he's having clearly these very physical nightmares, night terrors maybe. And his buddy slaps him awake, and he kind of says, oh, Bobby and Boots, it's you guys. But he's screaming through this nightmare. And I want to say that these screams, Grablorg, Yerg, like that's some very intense like onomatopoeia writing right there, and it's so 90s in its funny way. Tom Orzechowski starting a great run in this issue of like doing a lot of heavy lifting with the lettering and a lot of storytelling with the lettering as we'll go through. But Spawn kind of is like, oh, Bobby and Boots, his two buds in the alley, and he says, oh, mother, that was too damn weird. Demons and new age girls and really mean angels and a talking aardvark. A talking aardvark. He smoked too. Obviously, an allusion to meeting Cerebus. The funny thing is, it implies that his meeting with Angela was also in some way a dream. So the issue where he meets Angela, which is the issue written by Neil Gaiman, which leads to a lot of legal troubles for Todd McFarlane down the line, which is, we get into it in depth in previous episodes. At the end of it, he seemingly dies and is blinked out of existence by her lance, her like magical lance, which is like a Spawn killing tool. never really addressed again. He kind of just comes back here, and we're not sure if that means he just wakes back up because of some bigger purpose, or if it's just because Frank Miller was like, I'm not writing an issue about that.
It does seem that there's no, and as we move forward, Todd will hop back onto the book with the next issue with like another arc, and it does seem like that path is just sort of left open for whoever's going to pick up that thread somewhere later down the line. There's no exact understanding of like what that meant or was supposed to mean. It's unclear in that issue. Like we do see that panel from issue 10 in that issue, like that breakdown of him. So he's dreaming. Does that mean that issue 10 happens during the events of issue 9? So that really issue 11 happens right after 9?
It's hard to say.
It doesn't really make sense. And that's like one of the things that I kind of like about this little section of issues is like issue 8 is so focused on the ending of the Billy Kincaid story that it has really nothing to do specifically with Spawn.
You barely see Al Simmons, yeah.
Right. Issue 9 it establishes Angela. We get a little bit of Dark Ages Spawn or medieval Spawn. It's medieval Spawn. That's what it is. Sorry, not Dark Ages Spawn. It's medieval Spawn. We get some more history. I love the Angel guidebook to killing Hellspawn. That stuff's
interesting.
great.
There's a lot of world building there. Frank Miller just says, fuck it, we're doing gangs and drugs.
This just brings it back to a level where there's nothing. I like the exploration of his relationship with the folks who live in the alley. That his kind of de facto clan and friends, because nobody else.
They accept him.
Right.
They have called his costume a little queer, but they think that it's funny and fine that he wears it. So mixed bag there. I do want to say, speaking of his costume, this last panel on the page where he's incredible onomatopoeia there. You can cut that out.
I'm gonna keep it in. I'm gonna triple it.
Perfect. This last panel where he's like reaching out his creepy fingers, another great Todd hand. This has all the great hallmarks of a really cool Todd McFarlane Spawn panel, where it's like his creepy green eyes and teeth set in the shadows, and then his like creepy finger like pointing out, and he's like Bobby and Boots, and he's saying it very like, oh geez, relieved, but he's like pointing out like he's casting a spell at them. I love that panel. We move on and we learn that Boots, loves his boots, and very much like that, Spawn loves the alley. He's, saying to the other guys, like, I'm not having these dreams because I drink. I don't exactly know why I'm having these terrible dreams.
It's interesting because he says, I don't drink. He's going to drink in the very next issue.
Yeah.
I did read ahead a little bit, and like, he just hangs out with the guys and like cracks a bottle of wine wine with them.
Berry wine.
Some Mad Dog 2020.
Yeah.
So it's weird that like this detail is here. This is what makes the issue kind of feel a little bit slapdash and like kind of like thrown together. It's the plot
Maybe
is
Spawn's
generic.
about to start drinking to get rid of these nightmares,
I guess it's just that like, I like the stuff with the folks who live in the alley and that they are essentially Al's friends now. But then the book just takes a turn into Al recognizing the sounds of weaponry.
Yeah, so there's a big explosion, and they go, geez Louise, what a boom.
Which is funny because there's a giant boom Tom Warzikowski letter, which is great. And another one on the page as well.
And we get what we learn is that Spawn recognizes this sound as a 50 millimeter tsunami. It's a Japanese gun that has a quote unquote handheld tank stopper that can reduce a Bradley to shrapnel with a single shot, which that's not a handheld gun. I'm not a gun person, but I know that like that's a fantasy gun and it's fine. So it's being fired at a young woman who's screaming for help. She says, save me. And Spawn gets blasted with the cannon so hard that it goes through him as he tries to shield his body for this woman who's begging for help. And
kills Jubilee.
Kills Jubilee anyway. No, Jubilee! So it kills this young woman, and it says it turns her into spaghetti sauce, the lumpy kind. That's what they'd both be if Al Simmons were still alive, still human. So we learn that he's been, saved from this blast. On the next page, we see this very sort of like caricature drawing of a guy that's a little more cartoony than we usually get from Al Simmons, from Todd McFarlane. I want to say this guy had an action figure, or maybe became part of the Wetworks team, or this design was
He doesn't
copied.
not look like Overkill, like in
True.
proportion.
But I think I had an action figure of this guy holding 50mm guns, maybe with gold skin. It was at least a guy who looked exactly like him, down to the do-rag. And his do-rag says Boomer. So we learned that he's Boomer. Okay, Boomer. We're going to get that out of the way. The guy from the alley is saying, "You son of a bitch, you killed my pal." And Boomer says, "Maybe I'll kill you too, you drunk old turd. I got a case of the nasties tonight." And this is when Spawn comes back to life with a one-liner. "Bad case, your fault." Maybe that's 2 lines. I don't know. But he lets Boomer, who is terrified, go. He just takes his gun and lets him leave. Heals the wound on his chest using some of his powers. There's no power meter, but we know that he's used some of his precious abilities, as he will later on, to heal himself. His buddies are like just totally impressed by this. And so from there, the next page is sort of there's not even any words on it. It's just I guess.
This is a fill-in page, right? This is again what I mean. This like big splash.
It's a cool page, but it's essentially a pinup.
But it's colored differently than the rest of the. I mean, I don't know if this is fixed in the compendium. I could probably check. But like in the physical issue,
no, it's colored totally different. I mean, it's the same colors, but it's a different style. The lighting is totally different. It's just him against the moon, against the city. It's not him anywhere near the alley. I think that's Boomer's gun. I think that's the tsunami that he took from him.
Yeah, it just it's not.
It just looks like Todd McFarlane was like, gonna draw another Spawn pinup and threw it in there. And maybe Frank Miller was like, I don't know, just do another page.
It feels like the script was a page short.
Yeah.
And like this was an easy place. Because like if you just cut that out and went to the next page, you'd be fine.
So the next page is him tracking Boomer. And he hears them talking about, I did that creep chick. So we learned that she's a creep and that they're nerds.
And then, I mean, Spawn's like narration: creeps, nerds, gang names, street gangs, the plot thickens. Like, is this just.
It kind of thins.
Is this just the, like, breakdown that Frank Miller was like, yeah, I don't know, there'll be creeps and nerds, those are gang names.
They're very like the most rock and roll high school gang names, which I kind of love, but they're almost like they almost sound like gang names from the Warriors or something, and that's the vibe here too, is that these are almost like gangs from the Warriors. The Warriors would make it a little more clever. Like the Baseball Furies is a little better than if they were just the Batters or the Baseballs. But
yeah,
we also learned that Boomer's not supposed to be doing drugs. He's supposed to be selling them. He's not supposed to be doing them. And as we all know, criminals who sell drugs never do them either.
No, you can't get high on your own supply.
No, you can't.
That's the saying.
But you can wear magenta pants and a green tank top and a big gold cod piece as the guy whose name is Byron TM.
Trademark.
Which I think is funny, is saying, "Nerd stay clean, it's the rule, nerd stay clean." And I do his voice like that because he has this weird backwards forwards lettering that Tom Orzechowski kind of nails as both readable and weird. And it makes me feel like his voice is auto-tuned, like Megan Mithrigan.
It makes me feel like he's probably a pretty big Korn fan. And also...
oh, boy. Oh, man. Korn. Todd McFarlane. Famous Korn fan. We'll talk about it later. I have a personal Korn anecdote that I'll tease now and share later. I'll go ahead and say the TLDR, but when I was in high school, I was in a nu metal band, and our guitarist had a secret tattoo that he needed to hide from his dad. And so to hide his Korn tattoo from his dad, he got it on his lower back as a tramp stamp. So anyway, moving forward, this guy is basically speaks like the Corn logo, whatever that sounds like. Beatboxing his voice here. I will spare everyone from that. But yeah, he says, we don't do drugs. We sell drugs. We eat our junk food and steal our electronics equipment, and we kill creeps. So this is what Frank Miller thinks gangs do, is they dress like members of the Legion of Superheroes from like circa 1986. And when they were all wearing like big puffy jackets, and they eat junk food and they sell drugs.
What also, and we'll see this with Spawn eventually. Why does Todd love these big, like shin guard
Like circle boots.
things?
I have no idea, but let me tell you something. I thought that looked so fucking sick when I was like 15.
Is it just an easy way to not draw feet?
I think so, and I think it also makes them look kind of weird and like, immediately sets them apart. And also, I don't know if this has any influence, but to me, I loved it because it looked like the cyborg version of the Jinkos I love to wear. So
Yeah, I just like that they just come in different sizes. Like Byron, trademark, obviously, has them.
yeah,
Boomer does not have them, sort of. I don't know
no,
what's going on
he
with
has
his
like
feet.
he has pouches around his legs, like at the top of
Yeah,
his boots. He has
which
boot
that doesn't
pouches,
feel like a
pouch
great place
boots.
for pouches, because how would you even reach them?
I mean, I guess you can put pouches there. I've seen it on like tactical boots,
Yeah.
knives, and stuff. Like, but you wouldn't want to necessarily have a bandolier sliding down your leg. But then you've got the other guy here, Norton, whose name is not trademarked. In case you want to use it, you can do a weird cyberpunk gang member named Norton,
I
who's
mean, it would
dressed
make
like the
sense,
Wasp on an off day.
but I feel but I feel like Norton would probably be like against viruses, like
Yeah, he
not
would be
creeps.
antivirus.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's a really man. We're seasoned. Uh, so Byron, trademark, and the nerds, they're nerds. Nerds stay clean.
And I
Byron,
love I love Spawn's, again, his narration. White middle class computer geek street gangs. At least it's not a talking aardvark.
honestly,
Now,
credit to Frank Miller for recognizing first off who is actually profiting from drugs, and also for not just being like racist stereotype street gang. Like at least they're white computer nerds. These guys. On the next page, Boomer accidentally gets electrified. Oh nuts, he's toast. And Spawn decides, I'm not gonna bust him up right now. I'm gonna go find these fucking creeps, and I'm gonna turn this into a turf war.
which is like, a good plan.
Yeah, I guess.
I guess have them fight each other. Seems like they were already fighting, but you know,
And
escalate things. We're gonna meet James, trademark.
some of the narration I want to say, well, let me get to James in 1 second. And I'm so sorry to keep diverting us, but I do want to go back to some of Frank Miller's like hard boiled Frank Miller narration. It's like Spawn being like, this punk will be easy to follow and may lead Spawn to some answers. Then perhaps the killing starts. And then he has Spawn saying, like, I'm going to create the situation. Create the situation. And him creating the situation is setting up this gang war. And I just, that hard, it's again, hard boiled is the only way to describe it, is this very, like, very eggy, and not in that way, but very hard boiled, very Sin City-esque almost narrations that we get, these captions. And so Spawn does indeed set up this gang war, and we're going to see all their power. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was just gonna say the sort of staccato rhythm of it is fine, but it's just not really regular throughout. Also, I would argue that Spawn doesn't really talk the way that like Todd
No,
had established that Al sort of speaks. Now, granted, it's been
that's
quite a
sort
few
of
issues since,
external narration, but also there is no Spawn going like, my wife.
which is kind of all we know about Al at this point, is that he gets upset about his wife, but also this character is, again, like Todd explained, like, oh yeah, he looks like Batman. He kind of like, or he looks like Spider-Man and Batman kind of combined. and he's like an ex-military guy, and Frank was like, got it. Do I have to read any of the other ones? No. Last issue we had Cerebus though, and he was like,
Yeah, he got like the TLDR on the issues. And to be fair, he was probably writing this at the same time some of those other issues were being
yeah,
written. I get the impression that there was like a loose outline going on. So, I kind of get why Frank Miller's not really a deep fantasy world building kind of guy.
right.
He's not the kind of writer that is like, this is the cloak of Sephiroth or whatever the fuck like Neil Gaiman would want to write and did, and it was kind of good.
Do you think then that it's a little bit of a misstep for Todd to have Frank come in so early?
Well, I feel like this might have, if this was the first of the CoCoSwiss, it might have had a little more space to breathe as its own kind of
Mm,
issue and maybe as its own kind, but that also would have felt very much like just, okay, you got another guy to write a Todd McFarlane comic. It's fine. And like, that's kind of the vibe of this whole comic is like, it's fine, I guess, if you're really jazzed for Frank Miller.
yeah, I mean, I would even say that in terms of Todd's draftsmanship on the art side, I'm not as impressed as I have been with previous issues.
No, it's weirdly cartoony.
I don't think that I don't think Frank gives him a ton to do. Like not the way that Neil did, not the way that Alan Moore did, not even the way that Dave Sim does on a certain level where it's playing with these kind of bigger ideas. This is so bare bones, if that
Yeah,
makes sense.
it
Which
is.
again, we haven't had a lot of the world of Spawn explained to us at this point. We still have barely seen Jason win, and we're to understand that he's a pretty big deal. We are, if we're gonna go by these comics come out every month, we know that the this schedule was not exactly that because of the early days of Image having delays. But we're about a year into Spawn. We've not really gotten established big bad. We've not really gotten any answers
We've
about
gotten
what.
hints at it. We've gotten hints at, Jason Wynn. We've gotten hints at the person who killed him. But this has the feeling, you know what it is that this has the feeling of one of those like Marvel Comics, like 1970s inventory issues, where they
Yeah,
just have a script by Len Wein or somebody laying around that's a
Bill
perfectly
Mantlo.
fine script, that's perfectly fine. But if the main story is off its deadline, they throw in one of these done in ones where it's like, again, like the Hulk versus the Minotaur or whatever. That's
Yeah,
just, it's there and it's gone. And it's kind of has like a little bit of reference thrown into the script, like redone a little bit to reference the bigger plot line, but like it just doesn't carry any weight. And the art doesn't really carry much weight either. Like some of the designs are fun. Like the nerds are pretty fun looking, I guess.
but they also just feel both the nerds and the creeps do feel like knockoff X Force,
Yeah, absolutely.
like
Maybe
nothing.
that's meant to be the point, is that like they are. And so, we have the like James and whatever TM, where it's like the TM is obviously a joke on like, we're going to trademark the name James for our cyborg. Isn't that, like, we
Okay.
can do it too, Marvel. We'll have James trademarked, I guess, is almost the vibe. It's funny. Like I chuckled at it, especially the arrow that says, "This is James, trademark. Cyborg enforcer for the creep gang. Big and mean but rather emotional." And this is where we pick up in the story where we see that Spawn is going to set up a turf war between the nerds and the creeps, and the reason it's going to work is because they're actually warring over his alley. The
Yeah.
nerds want it because it's, a pathway into the creep territory that they want to infringe on. So they're computer geeks. The creeps seem to be cyborgs, and they are all wearing kind of like very like militarized X-Force uniforms. The girl that's killed, Buffy, almost looks like Domino in this panel where he's holding her.
Yeah.
And they're wearing like this purple and sorry, blue and pink, kind of purplish pink. Guy. They almost have like a Hawkeye looking guy, but this is the guy who kind of his text looks like he's meant to talk like this, where it kind of goes like the capitalization is all weird and kind of random throughout. And here's where we learn that they're upset about Buffy. Spawn is going to leverage this to his advantage to cause a turf war between the nerds and the creeps. We've said it like 50 times, but that's the only thing there is to this issue. That's the only
And like
plot
Spawn
there is.
shoots, like he saves Bobby and shoots he shoots James. In the actual issue, we do get a really sick Jeff Darrow insert poster
That's awesome.
with Big Guy and Rusty the Boy Robot a few years before Frank and him would actually put that out with Dark Horse, but and then it would become a TV show. And we get another ad for Rob Liefeld's Blood Wolf, which was supposed to be in the last issue and still hasn't been delivered, that pinup. But yeah, they start kind of firing on Spawn. I will even say that the choreography of this like gunfight isn't anything to write home about either.
It's just Spawn kind of tumbling around. The storytelling's kind of weird here. They come to the alley because that's where Buffy was murdered. That's kind of the thing that I think we kind of glazed over just slightly, is that Spawn discovers his home is in the middle of this turf war, and then he goes home, and at his home the creeps are there to get Buffy. They start trying to kill Spawn's unhoused friend. Sorry, the storytelling of it is a little jumpy, and we kind of muddled it up just slightly. Spawn blows the crap out of one of them in his alley, and then he does this big, dramatic, supernatural display where he says, "The battle will be fought here, the war will end here, all creeps will die." One of the creeps says, "Golly, James, this is really scary. I think maybe we should get out of here and tell the guys." And James is saying, "I'm so upset." And then we cut to back to the nerd camp.
He basically, to the creeps, he pretends he's from the nerds, and at the nerds, he pretends he's from the creeps, and he scares them both and tells them to meet at midnight in his alley so that they can fight, and they do.
These two back-to-back panels of him being scary. The first one where he's scaring the creeps in his alley and he's doing this big green supernatural display. I kind of like it. I like the way he's drawn. Spawn really not wearing his mask in this issue, just showing off his creepy zombie face. And then I like the display at the nerd camp is contrasted with these kind of very big, almost neon pink colors, which is a color we're not really seeing a lot in Spawn.
But also, it feels like Spawn's barely drawn on that panel.
Yeah, very
covered up by Orzechowski's lettering is almost like a save to be like, "Oh, Todd, you just drew a cape."
Yeah,
and
it's very kind of mushy, and you wonder how much on this he's kind of emulating some of the very impressionistic style that Frank Miller himself was developing by that point in the 90s. There may be some of that, and Todd's just not as good at it. But I like the coloring on the panel, and I like that one of the nerds is saying, "Hologram, gotta be a hologram." The last panel on the page is the two big gangs, each led by big, tough bruisers who look like, the biggest character ever in Street Fighter or something like that, coming together.
One looks like Zangief.
Yeah. One looks like Zangief, one looks like Abel, or Abigail's the name I was looking for. Abigail, massive Street Fighter character, looks a lot like that. Anyway, the next two pages are the gunfight between the two gangs, the nerds and the creeps. And I'm sorry for how repetitively I said turf war back there. A lot of this comes down to Orzechowski.
I mean, I like this as Orzechowski getting a show off. Again, though, it does feel like we've done this a few times, and it's where we do this sort of truncated fight. Choreography is not really important. It's more like lettering and kind of vibes more than it is like Todd McFarlane's really going to show off how cool he can lay out a page and like how cool he can make this happen. It doesn't really show off any of his skills at all. It doesn't show off any of Frank Miller's skills either. It's not like he wrote a really
it's almost a gag
fight scene.
It's almost a gag.
It plays like a Looney Tunes gag. It plays like the fight with Violator where they rip each other's arms off. I mean, it's that gag.
But that was at least looked cool in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
This is sort of the same thing, though, where it's just you see them kind of a couple of guys running in and getting blasted back. But there's a lot of heavy lettering on this set of 5 panels, even-sized panels all the way down the page. like sort of widescreen quote unquote panels of just this dumpster, and you see this view of this dumpster as a way off panel down the alley. It's just boom, blam, 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 boom, boom. It is kind of underwritten. It almost feels again like this big build up to this big moment, and then Todd and Frank being like, we don't really have the time and space to draw that anymore. We spent all that time on that one page that was just a pinup of nothing that had nothing to do with the story. So instead, we're just going to do this cheat where we do kind of one sort of like very kind of abstract panel of arms flying around and bottles and hands and cans and just clap your hands. And then this page of like panels where the lettering is doing all the storytelling and just letting you know they're shooting each other to bits off panel. And then finally on the last panel, Spawn says, okay, I think they're just about finished. And you see his hand creeping up over the alley.
It's kind of fun.
Now, the next double page spread showing the aftermath where there's just bodies blown apart everywhere and like cyborg limbs and dudes all like laying around and guns and Spawn there with his cape all wrapped around him. I actually kind of like this one quite a bit.
I do too, and I like the TMs next to Byron saying his name every time. That's still very funny. Yeah, I mean it's pretty brutal. There's just random like
it's like they suddenly remembered it's a horror comic.
There's also like weird, funny little details. Like there's just a dinosaur at one point.
Yeah, it does almost feel like a Where's Waldo of gore kind of thing. There's almost like a Sergio Aragonés kind of feel to it.
Yeah, exactly. There's a Supreme comic on the ground and a Youngblood. Like there are Image comics in the alleyway. Like if you look like really closely, you can see them. It's kind of silly and funny. And Spawn is like, all right, like Byron, it's like time to deal with you.
Yeah, Byron is the last one standing. He says, Byron still lives. Byron still lives. Byron rules the alley. Byron owns the alley.
Spawn's going to do the power that he hates doing the most, which is teleportation, which is a little confusing for us as a reader because we know that he's not done it very much.
Yeah, he did it once before and really hated it.
Right. And also, the narration is telling us like the armor is that Byron's wearing is making him pretty impenetrable. There's no way to get through to him.
So that's actually, I get it. Here's the key here. He says, Byron, let's play Alien. And Byron says, huh? And Spawn says, I love this caption. Teleportation is the worst.
Yeah.
And so he teleports. We don't see where he teleports. He just says, I might as well nosedive into a meat grinder is how bad he hates teleporting. And then Byron says, why'd he say that? Where'd he go? And then Spawn is saying it's the armor that's the problem. 5-layer Kevlar with a splash of an almost nuke-proof proton-heavy alloy. The armor's tough, but it's like the escape artist Houdini said about a bank vault he locked himself into. It's built to keep people out, not to keep people in. Now, the problem here is that the storytelling goes from one page to the other. Him talking about the armor is how tough it is to get through from the inside. How tough it is to get in, to get through from the inside. Because what happens is he blasts through Byron's chest cavity and blows him in half. It's like a scene from The Boys or something.
Yeah.
It's pretty fun. Deeply, I'm sure an influence on that, where he, just blasts Byron in half from the inside. And so what he's talking about there is how difficult it is to do because of how tough his armor is. But eventually it cracks because it's taking pressure from the other side. And I actually think that's maybe the best bit of the whole issue.
It does feel like that's, I mean, yeah, I'm gonna say something more. It's maybe the only good bit in the issue. Like, all right, I guess it does a weird thing though, where the power meter doesn't show up. So we're not to understand how much power has been used. Can he just do this all the time if he's really got to deal with somebody?
Well, he mentions using his power here, but we don't see the meter at all. And so it's one of those things where like Todd just didn't want to draw it or didn't throw it in or it wasn't included or accounted for somehow. I mean,
arguably also
probably
Frank Miller might not really.
Yeah, also, Frank Miller might not
really know about it.
Yeah. And so the panel of Spawn busting the guy in half, It could be better. It's fine. It's a cool panel. We see some rib cage behind him. I'm not going to criticize that it doesn't have enough like bits of gore necessarily,
No,
but just that it feels a little rough. It's a lot of ink splotches, a very rough drawing of Spawn. At the same time, it's pretty cool. Like he says, it's not fun and it's not pretty, but it works.
I kind of like the roughness of it to give the image a little bit of motion. Like even the coloring is like a little jagged and doesn't fit within the lines and stuff. Like his
Yeah.
eyes. Like so, I get it. He's moving. Like it's happening
Yeah.
quickly. Sure, that's fine. That's gonna lead us to like the last page where
Where
we
Spawn is tossing his head aside.
yeah, and Bobby's like, "Oh, what about the alley? Like, I'm not you popped out of that guy's chest or whatever, but like, what about the alley?" And Spawn just says, like, "We let the cops clean it up, then we move back in, and life goes on." And so
Yeah, Spawn's just like,
here we go. We're done here. This one's over.
yeah. In a way, it does feel very Looney Tunes. Or like, okay, I've been watching a lot of Spider-Man cartoons lately from the 80s and the 90s, a couple of the different Spider-Man series. And a lot of the time, especially in the older one, there'll be a gag like that where it'll be like this isn't a specific thing, but you could easily see Spider-Man in one of those cartoons setting
Just
up two
bursting out
gangs
of
to
somebody's
fight.
chest.
No. Yeah, absolutely. Would have been great. Sick. I mean, Carnage did do that in a comic recently to Deadpool. But the point is, you can easily see the turf war thing where Spider-Man's like, these gangs are fighting a turf war. I better set them up to fight. And then, like, you could easily see that being played off as the two sides coming together. Then off screen, you see Spider-Man going, wow, geez. And it's just going oink, ba-doink, doink, dunk, you know. And then he
Yeah,
comes in and they're all just laying around. And he goes, well, better web them up and leave them for the cops. Like you could see that being, it's a very childlike, almost cartoonish sort of presentation of this very violent thing where we see the aftermath. And it is, again, one of the most interesting 2-page spreads that's been in Spawn in a little while, and also easily the best one in this issue, where there's just carnage. And you
yeah.
almost wonder if that's meant to be the punchline of it. But even still, it just feels very like we've seen that gag a couple times already in Spawn.
This issue doesn't feel impactful the way that the other three issues have for the CoCoSwiss. It's weird because when you see like last issue, next issue, Frank Miller, like you're like, oh, okay, great, we're gonna get like something, and
Yeah.
we kind of get nothing. You know,
If
we get
anything,
we
you
get a
know,
story that could have been a story with the ferret or like any random like Malibu
Street
comic
Fighter number
character or something.
4.
Yeah, but
um,
like there's a disinterest in expanding the world of in expanding Spawn's world in past what's already been established.
I will take one. I will say one thing in its defense in that regard,
Hmm.
which is it is definitely not interested in the like mythological, cosmological, like personal demons of Spawn and his place in this, this battle between the ultimate forces of good and evil. It does give us, if anything, it gives us an example of how far Spawn is willing to go for his home and his alley. It will give us just, but I will say we've seen that before. It's not, again, not a new message about Spawn, but if it gives us any bit of like world building or anything like that, it's all centered on the alley, and also gives us a little bit maybe insight that this alley is actually maybe a bit of a hot spot. So when things start kind of centering around it at other times in the Spawn mythos, there's a little bit of foundation for that. But that is kind of, I think, incidental to the fact that, again, this could be a Batman story almost, like you said. This could be like, it could be a lot of different, like just a fill-in story almost.
Yeah, I think a lot of the reason though that I feel unsatisfied by this issue is because it doesn't even, I think maybe I unfairly kind of was like, yeah, Todd, I get it. all these characters exist, all this stuff happen. Yeah, I get it. But in a way, by him establishing Sam and Twitch, and by him doing the very Frank Miller newscasters, right?
Which don't show up in this Frank Miller issue.
Don't
It's
show
very
up at
fun.
all. But they gave you some context for the world, which it's a little bit like Frank was like, "Well, you were copying off my homework, so I'm gonna like
Yeah.
you did a worse version of what I normally do, so I'm
So
just
I
gonna
will
do a
too.
worse version of what you do, which is already a worse version of what I do, whatever."
Yeah.
But in a weird way, this what does Sam and Twitch think about the stupid cyborg gangs? Nothing,
We don't know. And
because
we
overt kill is was in the news.
yeah.
Like when that happened, that arc, which we didn't love that arc. We were like, yeah, okay, there's some stuff,
It
and there's a
had
big
some
cyborg
interest.
guy, and
I enjoyed it, from a storytelling standpoint. But again, you can listen to that episode.
but like this issue just it's a one-off. It feels like filler a little bit, like we were saying. It's interesting again to get to some of the letters page, which now the letters are very much about the CoCoSwiss and about Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman's work. But there's one letter that is kind of incredible that also kind of establishes what fans think of this. Not what critics are thinking, but what some fans are thinking. And I know we've already read that the letter where somebody's like, "You suck as a writer," basically. But
Yeah.
somebody opens this up with, "You asked me to name a person who's brought a life into a life. You asked me to name a person who thinks of his readers. You asked me to name a person who feels that it's the story, the plot, and the characters that count. You asked me to name a person with artistic talent. You asked me to name a person who's not afraid to show what he believes in. Chances are, I'd say Todd McFarlane."
Wow. Was that written by AI? Like 30 years ago? No, but that is a wild letter.
What's interesting is the rest of this letter goes on to say, like, I really like this book because there's a level of realism to it that I think is really important and that we don't get to see it from Marvel Comics. That like he's talking about how, I love that you've shown the anguish that Al feels for the loss of his wife.
Yeah, Spider-Man never feels anguish.
Yeah, that's true. There's something that Todd says in response that he's like, "Listen, this is quite a letter. Some of the themes that you stated will become bigger issues as the comic carries on. To me, some of the biggest heroes in the book are the outcast bums who accept Al Simmons at face value and ask very few questions. The quote so-called losers are showing Al Simmons far more compassion than I think the quote so-called normal world would show him. And in some respects, because they have been thrown away themselves, they have more insight into his struggles." Yeah, like
Yeah,
great.
sure.
Yeah, that's what you're trying to get across. That's good. I get that in this issue, Spawn gets to sort of repay the folks that he lives in the alley with by kind of saving their alley. That's good.
At the same time, though, that is a very hope she sees this kind of letter. Like that is a very like that's a simp letter. Like Spawn's. I don't even gonna do the acronym anyway, but like it's very like masterful gambit, sir, kind of letter. And I don't necessarily disagree with the sentiment that like Todd McFarlane always bets on himself and often seems to win and often seems to have a keen idea of what his own faults are. In
Hmm.
some ways he seems to think his faults are strengths business wise. We've discussed that at length and probably will again with his many lawsuits and very kind of unprofessional business dealings, but it seems he's worked a lot of that out now too. Anyway, that letter is very funny. That's a great letter.
Yeah, there's another one that starts off with, "Dear Mr. McFarlane, I think Spawn is high art and your writing ability is perfect. How could someone criticize you or your work? Jealousy? Most likely. Anger? Probably. Lack of intelligence? Of course. I'm sick of hearing everyone criticize your work. I think it's time to criticize the critics. You, the critics, complain about too much violence. Hello, wake up and look around. We live in a violent society. South
Oh
Central
man.
LA, Middle East, Bosnia, okay? You criticize about dialogue too much? Kent Kochi, who is another letter writer from a previous issue. So this letter writer is
This
specifically
is going off in the comments.
yeah,
Like they are going off in the comments.
they
right
are
now.
going off in the comments in letters that are written months apart at each other, and I can't wait to see if this
I
gets a response. This is a book, and books have words. If you can't read or don't
Whoa.
wish to, then watch a Disney movie. Oh, wait, Bambi's mother gets killed. To Travis McKinnon, your
I mean, that was
precious Marvel
traumatizing.
has anti-image propaganda. Look at Venom #1, page 6, last panel. The sign in the background says, no pets, no parties, loud music, cooking, spitting, smoking, tie-dyes, and young bloods. Take out the hyphen, and what do you see? Young bloods. Apparently Marvel
Whoa, conspiracy.
Apparently, Marvel is not on, quote, the same comic book industry side. To the others who have complained about religious conflicts, this is a fictional comic book, not true. Just
This is
in
the
case you
first
weren't aware.
Reddit. That was the first Reddit comment of all time.
You don't
It
have to take
appeared
it
in a Spawn
seriously
comic.
or believe it. The comic is for entertainment. Todd, I feel your artwork is the best in the business, better than Marvel, DC, Valiant, and the rest of Image. The stories are terrific too, so original. The characters in your books do not resemble Marvel's as some Image characters do. The Billy
Wow.
Kincaid story was the best. Well, all your stories are. Spawn is the comic my friends and I talk about the most. Why? Because it's the best. I've never heard one of my friends speak anything bad about Spawn. If they do, I can promise you they won't be my friends anymore. Just kidding. One more thing. Keep up the Marvel bashing. It's great the way you guys rub it in. After all, Image has better quality comics, stories, and artwork, especially Spawn, than Marvel. Some advice to Marvel: quit while you can.
That is an insanely that is a wild letter. First off, I said the last one was like a simp letter. This one sounds like Todd McFarlane wrote it to himself. Like the level of like in Venom issue number, like that. Like I said, that is the first Reddit comment ever written, and somehow it appeared in a Spawn comic in 1993 or 94, 30 years ago. That it's almost the 30th anniversary of that letter, Pierce, and we should really acknowledge that because that is
Listen,
really wow.
Irishman Matt McGloin, if you're out there, we'd love to have you on the show. I will say this: I will have anybody who wrote a letter in, especially one that we read in the show.
Okay, that's fair.
If you can
That's only
prove that you
fair.
wrote this letter,
We'd love to talk to you.
we would love to talk to you and have you on the show.
I think Spawn is high art, and from there it only goes up. Now, I'm not saying comics are not and cannot be high art. I'm not saying Spawn isn't art or good. Even Todd McFarlane isn't saying Spawn is high art. Todd McFarlane is saying Spawn is my job. There was that letter last issue where they talked about, people being critical of the writing and stuff, and Todd's response was just like, people
You
are
don't
buying.
like it?
I'm crying all the way to the bank, Liberace
Yeah.
style. Like it's, if people didn't like it, they wouldn't buy it, and that's true. People are buying these comics and enjoying them, and I don't begrudge that at the time, or even now with these populist comics, because that's just what they are, as entertainment. But to jump in with it, it's very much like my politics are easily outlined in the MCU kind of energy. Like,
Yeah.
go watch a Disney movie, nerd.
There is like a 90s edginess that, like, obviously, like, you and I lived through, but now is having its like weird resurgence. That is the 20-year cycle of all things.
Yeah,
That,
it's
like,
just, yeah, we could get into that, but
yeah,
that's a
Matt
whole thing.
McGloin wrote this letter. He skateboarded to the comic book shop. He pulled out his chain wallet. He plunked down his 2.95 for his new issue of Spawn. Like,
I just want to be clear, that's exactly what I was doing too.
yeah, I think, yeah. I mean, I think it's great, and
It really is just a time capsule in a way.
that's what's so amazing. And I love that Todd has printed the letters where people are being critical of him, but then was like, all right, enough of that. Let's
Yeah,
print
now
some
let's
letters where
print
people
the ones
really
where
like.
people are saying Spawn is high art, and they're like naming their kids Al Simmons, like I would want.
How many kids do you think are named Al as a result of Spawn?
I don't know. Al is my middle
Or
name.
Wanda? Whoa, you were named after Spawn? That's
I
crazy.
was. My grandfather, Spawn.
We well, your middle name, your full middle name,
Is Alwyn. But I was named after my grandpa Al.
who was Jason Wynn's brother.
Well, my grandfather, this is little known, my grandfather is actually a world famous assassin and big wife guy.
Oh boy. really loved your grandma.
He did though. My grandma Hilda was great. His name was Al. I'm named after. My middle name is after. That is true. But he also was a government assassin, a world famous government assassin.
Made a deal with the Malbolgia.
Dude, okay, I'm gonna divert this with a personal anecdote for 30 seconds. When I used to have this D&D group that involved this dude who I won't name his real name, but he for a little while he did try to insist that people call him Chaos. No one ever did, but he was one of those guys. Okay. He told us he went to he joined the army and he left our D&D group. And when he was joining the army, instead of just saying I joined the army, whatever, he was like, guys, I gotta leave the group. Turns out my dad has resurfaced. He's a government assassin and he's coming for my family. So I have to go in for special training because I'm probably the only one who's going to be able to defeat him. And we were just like, all right, Chaos, whatever you. So that is a true story about how I played D&D with Al Simmons.
Incredible.
Yeah. Anyway, I hope he survived. I hope he killed his dad.
Well, I think that's all there is to say about the ending of the CoCoSwiss and this Frank Miller. This Frank Miller issue. Next issue, we're going to get into a two-parter called Flashback.
Where Spawn starts drinking.
Yes, and Todd is back writing. Here's the solicit text for Spawn number 12. CIA Chief Jason Wynn suspects Terry Fitzgerald of compiling damaging information against his bosses. He considers disposing of Terry the same way he disposed of Al Simmons. Elsewhere, the bums celebrate the safety Spawn has given them. The celebration takes an ugly turn when a bum tries on Spawn's mask, only to nearly be strangled by it.
I remember that. That was a cool scene.
Yeah, this is a semi-crossover with Youngblood. We are not going to cover the Youngblood issue.
No.
I don't want to, but I will read it and give you context, and we'll talk about it because we'll have to. But Spawn 13 and not Youngblood number 8 or whatever the Youngblood issue is. We're not going to fully cover that. I think that's it.
So this issue, ultimately kind of a mess, has some fun bits, but it really feels like Todd was like, I'll get Frank Miller. And Frank Miller was like, yeah, whatever, I'll do that. And it just wound up, I'm excited to get back, honestly, to the Todd Father a little bit and a little bit more into the Spawn mythos. So
me too. I'm excited for him to. It feels like we've diverted for a few issues now. Since we saw Overt Kill and we got that arc, and then we sort of went into the CoCoSwiss and did some other stuff. And so I'm excited to get back to Todd and his vision for the book. And I think it'll be, I start at the beginning of this episode, I was kind of saying like, oh, we're like a year into Spawn and we haven't really established stuff. But if you think about it, if you take out 4 guest issues, we're still very solidly in year 1.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm excited to get back to it. And we're on the verge of Todd starting to cede some of those art duties as well. So
yeah,
to a favorite of yours and mine, Mr. Greg Capullo. So that's coming soon.
Talk about him soon.
Listeners, thank you for listening. If you want to shoot us your thoughts, if you want to tell us that Spawnography is high art, you can email us at spawnographypod@gmail.com. Rate, review, subscribe, all that stuff on Spotify or whatever podcatcher you use, or Apple Podcasts and whatever nonsense. You can find me at PE Lightning on the bad Elon Musk site. Where are other places too? George, what about you?
You can read my writing every heckin' day at newsarama.com, where I work, and you can find me on social media. My handle is @CryptTrash everywhere you can find me. Rarely on Instagram, sometimes on Blue Sky, pretty much never on Twitter anymore. But yeah.
Sweet. Till next week.
For Todd so loved the world,
he gave his only begotten Spawn. Later.
Spawn!